Hello and welcome to Career Strategies for International Students. My name is Dr. Jana Jaffa, representing the Small Business Career Center. We are excited to offer you an exciting program this evening, broken up into two panels. The first hour will be recorded and made available on the Small Business Career Center website following the event. From 4 to 5 p.m., we invite Dr. Ken Graham, PSU alumnus and retired Global Head of Leader Development at Royal Dutch Shell, and Rebecca Zoshak, lecturer for English for professional purposes in Intercultural Center, EPPIC. Following the presentation, Susan DeAmico and Brian Algio from GISA will give a presentation about OPT and answer questions you may have about working in the US. Please submit your questions via chat at the bottom of your screen. And we want to take this time to thank our partners for their support in tonight's event. And a special shout out to CISA and CUSA for their assistance in promoting this event. So with that being said, I'd like to invite Jennifer Tice to introduce our first speaker.
Thank you so much, Jana. Hello, everyone. Warm greetings from a very cold and snowy University Park campus here at Penn State. I hope you are all doing well and your spring semester is off to a successful start. I'm absolutely delighted to join you today to introduce our featured speaker, Dr. Ken Graham. I've had the opportunity to work closely with Ken over the past few years on designing programming and conferences focused on global career development. So we're very fortunate that he's agreed to speak with us today and share some of his insights. As Jana mentioned, Ken is retired from Royal Dutch Shell, specifically focused on global leader development. Ken is also a Penn State graduate. He holds 3 degrees from Penn State, all from the Small College of Business. And he is also one of our most dedicated volunteers at the university. He serves on the Presidential Leadership Academy Board of Advisors for the Schreyer Honors College. And he is also a member of the Provost's Global Advisory Council, where he provides advice and guidance to university leadership on the university's global engagement strategies. Ken has lots of insights and wisdom to share with you today, and I really do encourage you to take advantage of the chat and ask questions throughout his remarks and also afterwards. So without further ado, it is my pleasure to introduce Dr. Ken Graham.
Thank you very much, Jennifer. I appreciate that very much. We are excited that so many of you have signed up for today's event and are listening in or watching from wherever you might be. I'd like more than anything else that the focus of these comments will be a focus on you, where you may be coming from, what you hope to generate in your career, and the directions that you might take. I would start with an example. I recently asked 30 undergraduates. This was just before COVID shut us down, so it was about a year ago. I asked 30 undergraduates, how many of you know exactly what you'll do after graduation? 2 hands went up. They were both going to med school. 26 hands went up when I said, how many of you know a general shape or a general direction that you'll take? 26 out of 30. And finally, I asked, how many of you have no idea? You're about to figure it out after you graduate. And 2 hands went up. A fascinating thing happened as part of this process. I discovered that most of us are shaping where we're headed, but we don't have a concrete plan. And that's actually good. If you're going to med school, if you're going to law school, if you're going to grad school, you still need to think about what happens after. So my first suggestion has 2 parts. 1, think about what you would like to be doing 20 years from now or more. You cannot plan every step that will get you there, but just think about what that might be like. I'll suggest this to you. One study here in the US shows that more than half of all university graduates will end up in leadership at some time during their career. I've worked a lot in leadership, so for that reason, that will be a focus of some of my comments. The second element to this is after you get a general feeling of what it might be like for you 20 years into a career, whether that's working for an existing organization or possibly first working for an existing organization, learning about leadership, learning about what you can contribute, and then starting your own organization. So this is the innovative entrepreneurial side of leadership. Whether either of these directions or both of them make up a good, important portion of your career. I'd like to start from that perspective. Start out 20 years, work backwards, and ask what are some of the things you can do. I believe one of the things many of you will ask yourselves is, how do I find good professional work in the United States? Though that topic will come up during today's event, that's not exactly where I'm going to focus my comments. I prefer to focus my comments on beyond the US alone. And there's a reason for that. You know that over the last 4 years of federal level politics in this country, there has been a lot of pressure to restrict permission to work in the US. So many of you have non-US passports, and that opportunity is something you'll end up pursuing even in today's event by talking to those who know that field well. So at the risk of disappointing you that I'm not going to provide you the secret answers that will cause success for you if you'd like to work in the US, I would like to talk about opportunities that exist globally, and some of them will be far more attractive than opportunities in the US. Let me do it this way. May I suggest that you consider what organizations would you like to work with during the first 10 years after graduation that will teach you many of the things that lead to success in leadership and in your functional task work. Some of us study accounting and go into accounting. Some of us study marketing and help organizations sell what they're going to do. Many of us study engineering, IST, the basic sciences, etc. We find ourselves in environments where we have to try out in order to discover, we have to try out different job types in order to discover what we can do well. I'd like to focus for the next few minutes, please, on the question of how do you do this if you can't work in the US? There is good news. I was an experienced hire to Royal Dutch Shell in the Netherlands. I had never worked for Shell in the US. I had tried to, I had applied, but was not successful, and I ended up going elsewhere. So I'm an experienced hire in the Netherlands with a US passport. What does it take? It takes a set of permissions to be allowed to work in the Netherlands, and under Netherlands law, you cannot stay forever. The good news is that the global brands we think of, whether they are older line companies like Shell, IBM, General Electric, or some of the offshore older line companies like, let's say Siemens in Germany, or ABB, also an engineering type company. Someone like Fiat in Italy, British Telecom, Cable and Wireless. Any of the older line brands will have established methods for hiring people no matter the color of your passport, and they have strategies to allow you to work in different cultural environments. You just don't stay there. There is a huge set of opportunities in this space if you lift your sights beyond simply working in the US, in case you don't have that opportunity. In a fascinating way, those who are hired to Royal Dutch Shell with non-US passports can end up working in the US. It's permissible. It just can't last forever. Shell does something that I think is incredibly important, and I would suggest you look for in any employer. I'll pick another employer, 3M Company, headquartered in the Twin Cities, has massive operations around the world. I've been to several of them, including one in Shanghai. This particular company prides itself in allowing up to 2 years to have new employees work in different departments and different activities, different functions, so they find their interests, so they find what works for them. If you're of the entrepreneurial type, 3M is really good about encouraging product innovation, market innovation within the company. And you don't have to start in the US. You can start in Shanghai. You can start in Brazil. There are locations that make this possible. More names. Amazon. I'm aware of a Penn Stater who was contacted while she was working in South Africa, was hired to Munich, worked there several years, had a wonderful job opportunity offered to her in London. This is the sort of nomadic lifestyle that is possible. I suggest that you look for companies that provide these, they're often called rotational programs, that they provide the opportunity for you to spend up to 6 months in new geographies, as well as new departments, new functions, and learn the organization. Do you have to stay there for a lifetime? No. Can you choose to stay there for a lifetime? Often. Not always, but often. And are they decent training grounds if you would like to start your own organization? Depends on the type of business you would like to start, and it depends on the type of organization you're in. Hewlett Packard. Hewlett Packard has massive operations in Malaysia. Would you start in Malaysia if you were an industrial engineer, improve their processes, move into leadership, and be assigned anywhere in the world that Hewlett Packard is operating, including the US? It can be done, and it can be done without a US passport. You simply don't focus on being employed in the US, and still opportunities open up. How about Microsoft? Yes. Google? Absolutely. There are quite a few of these types of opportunities. What if the opportunities that you're looking for aren't associated necessarily with the US? For example, would you like to work for Alibaba? They operate both onshore in China and offshore. Where would you like to start? Hong Kong, Shanghai, or one of the other operations, especially in the Pacific Rim? These opportunities are available as well. I suggest looking for opportunities with organizations so that you show up as a whole person, not just a set of task skills. The most important decision you'll ever influence in your life is the decision by others to invite you to join them to do meaningful work. It's a task of influence as much as anything. It's made up of 3 elements. You have to know the task that you're being asked to do. If it's engineering, you ought to be good in engineering, etc. That is important when you first graduate, but it is not sufficient, especially if your employer wants to hire both your current ability and your potential to move ahead. One of the things Royal Dutch Shell did very well, especially for an older line company, was to choose both on demonstrated performance in school and through case analysis, make selections that caused people to reveal how they thought about building a business. So the 3 elements are task skills, behavioral skills, and direction setting skills. Task skills, once again, engineering, science, high tech, business. Many of elements there. Behavioral skills. How do you interact with others? Can you work well on a team, or are you more of an individual contributor? Direction setting skills requires a few extra comments. Direction setting skills are about making the organization what it must become. You won't be asked to do this on the first day. I think you're going to want to look for opportunities to contribute to improving the organization's performance, its own performance, and especially how it treats those whom it serves. I think you'll want that to occur in such a way that you are seen, along with members of your team, as a team player, influential in your team, and someone who can do more the more experience you have, especially in situations that involve making what is become what the marketplace or those being served need. It is in that space where you'll probably build your career. Don't be anxious over the question of whether or not you should join an organization as though it's a single decision. The youngest generation in the US is accused by some journalists of changing jobs too often. I'm not sure there is such a thing as too often. Oh, if you stayed only 7 days and then left, that might be way too short in terms of tenure. But your first decade out of school should be spent discovering what you're good at by doing things, applying yourself, and making those discoveries. Then and only then should you ask the question, do I stay? Do I move on? And yet, many people within the first 10 years of career will have up to 5 different employers. An average of 2 years isn't bad. If you're leaving before the first service anniversary, try to stick it out, because your learning curve has not yet leveled off. You're still learning a great deal about organizations. It's okay to choose an industry and stick with it. If you like what is known on Wall Street as fintech, financial technology, automating in very innovative ways how we handle personal finance and business-to-business finance. If you like that segment, it's okay to go to work for a large bank, but you probably don't want to stay if they're not innovating at the rate that some of the newer online financial services companies are innovating. So you can start at the larger organization, whether it's a Japanese registered bank, a British bank, a South African bank, a Canadian bank. You can start there, learn what's going on, and move on with the innovations that you would bring to the industry. I'm going to hit the pause button right now, and we've agreed to do something. Rebecca is going to have some comments for you after I take, if you please, I know there are many more than 2 people on this connection. I would like to take exactly 2 questions, and I'll ask Jana if she would please serve up the first question, and I'll comment on it. Jana, please.
So we have a question in the Q&A. It's very specific. They're asking, is it possible for an international aerospace engineer to work at NASA?
Wow. I'll tell you, my reactions are these. I honestly don't know. And for that reason, here's where I would look. I would ask NASA that question. I believe if the skill set is, shall we say, rare, doesn't have to be unique, but rare, then the visa requirement could be met and the individual could do so. Let's also remember that NASA operates offshore. If you're into telemetry, Goldstone, the giant facility in Central Australia, may be an awfully good choice. You're right, Jana, that's a specific question. I like the hopefulness behind that question. I wish I had the absolute answer, and I don't. Next question,
Here's
please.
a more generic question that might represent more of the population.
Yes.
How to work internationally during current pandemic times? So navigating COVID-19 and maybe onboarding virtually.
Yes, a lot has been done in onboarding virtually. I'll give some examples here with different kinds of employers. We know some names, and these will be especially familiar in SMEAL, but they extend well beyond SMEAL. Ernst & Young, both an accounting tax type firm, but also a consulting firm. Of course, McKinsey, KPMG, which is actually headquartered in Germany. All of these will hire undergraduates, and will hire undergraduates who do not have US passports, and first assignments may be anywhere in the world. Consulting is somewhat unique and a wonderful opportunity. If you're in the middle group that I spoke about, among the 26 out of 30 who have a feeling of the kind of work they would like to do, but don't know for sure and don't know exactly where they would like to do it, my strong encouragement is, if you can, get yourself selected by a consulting firm, because first assignments can be around the globe and often are. Secondly, if an assignment is in one country and you'd like a broader assignment in another country, they are very responsive to requests. The third reason to consider consulting is you are getting paid to look for your next job. It's almost unique in that respect. How do you work as a consultant? They send you out to work with, as a team member, inside some of the very companies that we have named, some of the global brands, or some of the local companies or regional companies. I did an assignment about 8 years ago with an engineering and contracting firm in Oman. Some of you will have to look up where Oman is. It is It shares the Arabian Peninsula with Saudi Arabia. It faces the Arabian Sea, and a little point of it is right on the Strait of Hormuz. What does an engineering and construction company do in Oman? They build roads, they build hospitals, and they build infrastructure for oil and natural gas fields. Those kinds of examples. Jana, should we turn it over to Rebecca next? And I'll stay on here in case there are questions later that might come my way.
Sure, if that's what you'd like to do, then I'd like to next invite Rebecca Zoshak, I'm sorry for butchering your last name, from EPPIC to give her portion of the presentation.
Great. Hello, everybody. It's very nice to not see you, but be with you here virtually. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen so that we have some slides to look at together. Jana, I have a quick question for you. Can participants type into the chat without going through the Q&A if I ask them questions?
Yes, they can type directly into the chat.
Perfect. Perfect. So hi, I'm Rebecca. I work at EPPIC. EPPIC stands for English for Professional Purposes Intercultural Center. We're housed here at University Park. And if you are curious about our services, I'll mention a few throughout my talk today, but I'm always happy to talk more about what it is that EPPIC does, if that's something that you're interested in. I'm here today to add a little bit of thought, a little bit of information on this topic of how to be more person than paper, which I really love something that Ken actually just mentioned. He said, you know, how can you guarantee that you're going to show up as a person and not just a set of skills? And I think that dovetails really nicely into what I'm going to be spending my time talking about today. And that is, how can we make sure that we're three-dimensional when we meet potential employers and not just a resume, not just a CV or a cover letter? So before I get kind of into the how, I just want to breeze through these kind of breakdowns of questions that we often see from career services, the types of questions you often see in interviews or even when you're just chatting with potential employers. And there's kind of categories, I think, of these questions. So for each of these, I challenge you to think not how would I answer this, but why is the employer asking this? Okay, so the first group of questions here is this: talk about your skills. I think this is the easiest one to answer. Why, right? Of course, the employer needs to know that you're qualified for the position. They want to know that you can do the job, right? So I think that one's not a difficult question to answer. But what about when the employer asks questions about the employer itself, right? As an organization, as a company, why are they asking those types of questions? I think this also goes back to something that Ken stated, right? This idea that the employer is interested in how you fit into that organization. The employer is interested in maybe where you see that organization going in the future. And also that you know what that organization is, right? That you've put the time in to learning about them before they have to put in the time learning more about you. So that's a little bit, I think, of the why they might ask about the employer itself. And then the last one here, I think this is the most challenging when we ask ourselves why. Why might employers ask us questions about ourselves, right? What are your strengths and weaknesses? How would your colleagues describe you? These types of questions, I think, can be very off-putting, can be very mysterious. What is it that the employer is trying to get at when they ask these types of questions? And this is really where my topic of being more person than paper comes into being, right? This idea that these types of questions allow the employer to see you as a human, right? Not as a resume. And it's important, although we're not these people, it's important that we come across as individuals, right? As unique people who are applying to this job and bring our own unique experiences, our skills, our know-how, and our personalities, everything that makes us, us, right? So that's really where I want to focus today, this idea of more person, less paper. So how, right? That's the big question, is how do we do this? We might get through all these whys, but that doesn't really help us when we're talking with the employer. So what are some strategies that we can use to become, more three-dimensional when we talk to employers? And this kind of leads us into this idea of the questions we get from employers that are like, tell me about a time when, ... These are a lot of questions that you might be asked by employers because they want to hear about your experiences, right? It's not yes, no questions. It's not, can you do this specific task? It's tell me about a time when. And this is your opportunity to show them yourselves as individuals, right? And we do this by sharing anecdotes. So by anecdotes, I just mean short stories about your experiences, short stories about things that you have lived through, that you have participated in, teams that you have worked with, really anything. This can be, if you're an undergrad, an experience that you have in a club, in a class, working with a team. This can be an extracurricular activity. If you're a grad student, this can be doing your own research, participating in a lab group. There are no limits where these anecdotes can come from. But the goal of an anecdote is to really meet in the middle, grouping together skills that are needed for the job and highlighting your own personal strengths and experience, blending those together to show the employer who you are. Right? And it almost doesn't matter what the question is as much as you sharing those anecdotes that are most relevant to your experiences, your skills, right? And your being as like we said, that person, not paper. So when we get these questions, tell me about a time when, I encourage you to have a structure in mind when you're answering these types of questions. We at EPPIC and also Career Services use the STAR technique, which you'll see here is just the first letter of a bunch of words. May or may not be helpful to you. It's not the only way to structure anecdotes. I'm not here to tell you there's one way to tell a story. We all know that there are a lot of different ways to tell a story, but it is important that your story has a structure, right? One, because it will help you organize your thoughts as you tell the story, but two, it will help the listener to understand what you're sharing, right? If you follow a structure that is transparent to them, that allows them to follow your path of thinking. So this is a strategy that we use at EPPIC to introduce the situation, to talk about the task or the challenge, and then talk about what you did, what action you took, and what resulted. And then depending on your field, right, sometimes they also expect some little bit of reflection, what you learned, what you would do differently, how this has shaped who you are or how you do this type of job. So I'm not going to get too much into this because we are English for professional purposes, Intercultural Center. So of course I care about the English that we're using to in these certain contexts, but I'm not going to get too far into this because if this is something that you're interested in practicing, or if this is something that you're interested in getting feedback on, I encourage you to take advantage of EPPIC services, which are called EPPIC Individual Consultations, which are one-on-one meetings where you can come and practice answering questions with us and we can give you some feedback on your answers. So if that's something that you're interested in, feel free to have a look at our website and sign up there. What I would like to talk about really as far as this answering question goes is specifically this strengths and weaknesses portion, okay? So I think that this is a really helpful way to look inward and to think about our own strengths and weaknesses. What are we really good at, right? It's important to know yourself. You know yourself better than anyone else will ever know yourself, right? So you need to be able to really put the time in and think about these answers so that you can sculpt these anecdotes, so that you can write these stories in a way that shows who you are to these potential employers. Okay, so I'm not going to make us do all of these because, of course, I'm here for a limited time, but I'm going to encourage you on your own later to think about things like strengths, weaknesses, interests and hobbies, and positive characteristics. Again, you might be thinking, this has nothing to do with the job, right? Why do they care about my interests and hobbies? But remember, your role is to be a three-dimensional person, to show them who you are. Does that mean telling them everything about yourself? No, but it does mean you're going to have to be able to carry on a pleasant conversation with these people, either small talk, social engagements, meals, over Zoom, or in the actual interview itself, where you share a little bit of yourself so that you come across as a person and not just a list of skills or a list of experiences. So this is something that I encourage you to do on your own. The good thing about this is it doesn't matter if you're employable in the US. The things you can't control, things like, is the employer you want to work for hiring? Is there visa sponsorship? We can't control these things, right? But we can control knowing ourselves and crafting these stories that show ourselves truly and, advantageously to potential employers. So you might be wondering, well, if you're not going to make me do this, what are we going to do for my time? Well, I'm going to make us do it a little bit. Because of course, EPPIC is all about teaching and activities and interaction. So I am going to ask us to do a little bit of an activity while I have some time with you today. And we're going to focus on specifically strengths and weaknesses today. Okay, so a little bit of knowing yourself. So I have a few criteria here. Firstly, it's important to be honest. That's true for all parts of a job interview, all parts of interacting with an employer. You always want to be accurate describing yourself, right? And you want to be honest. So you want to pick a strength that is something you really feel that you are good at. And you also want to pick a weakness that is accurate, right? It's something that does describe you, okay? It's also important to pick strengths that are relevant, okay? You might be super fast or super tall, but it doesn't really matter, right, for being employable. So pick strengths that are relevant to the job. Does that mean it has to be a skill set? No, absolutely not. It can be some of those soft skills that are applicable to many jobs, right? Ken talked a lot about leadership. So strengths that have to do with leadership or working on a team, these types of things are helpful strengths that apply to all jobs, right? It doesn't have to be specific for the posting that you're applying for. Then when we get to the weakness, it's important to pick something that's not too personal, okay? So yes, they're asking the question, but no, they don't want to know something about your mental health, right? We never want to disclose any sort of medical information, anything, about our marriage status or our age. Those types of things are off the table in the job interview. But it is important to pick a weakness that is relevant, not too personal, but also something that you're actively overcoming or managing through strategies that you have developed, okay? So I'm gonna give an example of that in a little bit, but first I want us just to take some time on our own to brainstorm something you are good at, a strength that would be relevant when talking to potential employers, and something that maybe you struggle with, something that you find challenging. Okay, so I'm going to shut up for a minute and I'm going to let us all just think on our own. Okay, and I would encourage you, when you come up with a strength, to go ahead and type it into the chat box. Okay, let's try to list as many strengths as we can. When you come up with your weakness, you don't need to do that. I understand not everyone likes to share weaknesses, so we can just think of that on our own. We don't need to share that one. But as you're brainstorming this strength and this weakness, go ahead and type our strengths into the chat box. Let's see how many we can list in this 1 minute. Okay, so I'm going to mute myself for a minute and let's see our strengths as a group. Great. These are excellent. I'm especially jealous of those of you out there who listed 3, 4, or 5 strengths. You are truly strong, and I wish I were you. That's wonderful. So yeah, these are really good. I love how specific some of you are being. I think that that's really helpful if you can really specify what it is that you're good at, what it is that you bring to a team, what it is that would make you, potentially a good employee for this group. I think that these are really excellent starting points. But you might be thinking, yeah, Beck, that's great, but so what? How do we use this, right? How do we use this when we're talking to employers? Well, of course, it's possible, right, that the employer will ask you flat out, what are some of your strengths? And you're going to want to be able to respond to that, right? But there's another way we want to be addressing these strengths in our conversations with potential employers, right? And that's through our anecdotes, through our stories, okay? So I want you to look back at one of the strengths that you typed into the chat box, and I want you to start thinking, what is a story that I could tell that shows this strength, right? Because it's one thing to tell someone you're detail-oriented. It's one thing to tell somebody that you're, good at time management. But it's another thing if you can layer that into these anecdotes, layer that into your stories, and show them that you're good with deadlines because you've shared this experience where there was a struggle getting something done. Because of something you did, you were able to get, the project done on time. Or you show that you're detail-oriented by showing that your attention to a certain project resulted in this conclusion, right? So you really want to think about not just being able to list your strengths, but being able to show your strengths through these anecdotes. So that when you get the question, tell me about a time when, you're not just telling them about a time when. So tell me about a time when you had a conflict with a peer. Tell me about a time when you led a team, okay? Yes, you're going to tell them about a time when you led a team, but you also want to layer in characteristics that you feel are your strengths into that story. So they're getting an answer to their question, and they're also getting a reiteration of what it is that you bring to their organization. Okay, so we have this 2 kind of layers of the strengths weakness question. 1, listing, right? Answering them directly, and 2, folding these strengths and folding our experiences into these anecdotes to show them that you're a good fit for the position. So I highly recommend wherever you are in the job search process, even if you haven't started looking at all and you're just wondering what you will be doing after graduation, start collecting anecdotes now, right? So it's important, I think Ken said this, it's important to find out what you're good at. You can be doing that in all of your interactions, in your classes, in your internships, in your entry-level jobs. You always want to be collecting these stories that show your strengths in addition to being able to tell your strengths. So keep a Word document, open up a notes app on your phone and jot down a couple words when something happens, because it's incredibly hard to think of anecdotes years later, right? But if you make a note of it when it happens, you can potentially use that in a conversation with a potential employer later on. So I am going to flip the script, right? And talk a little bit about not only our strengths, but our weaknesses. I promised that I wouldn't make anyone share, and I will not. Although I would say if it's something you are uncomfortable sharing, it might not be the correct strength, the correct weakness to choose when talking to employers. But again, when we're thinking about our weaknesses, we want them to not be that personal. And we really want to focus on being able to share them in a way that also shows we are overcoming them or we are managing them. Okay, and I said that I would give you an example of that. I'm going to do that now. So I want you to think about the weakness that you brainstormed. Okay, so something that maybe you find is a challenge for you. Okay, and I want you to think about, how do you manage that challenge? How do you make sure that challenge doesn't overcome you, right? So an example here is procrastination, right? I think this is something that some people struggle with. The idea that I meet my deadlines, but I end up doing a lot of my work right before the deadline, okay? So what is a way that I personally managed this problem when I had it? I use artificial deadlines. So that means when I'm working with a team and we have a group project that's due on a Friday, within the team, we make a deadline that's that Monday, right? So everyone has to send their work to each other on Monday. Then we have Tuesday through Thursday to revise, and then we're not rushing to finish before the Friday due date, right? So artificial deadlines is a way that I could share my weakness, but then I could also exhibit, I could also show that it does not control me. I'm able to deal with this weakness. And in some ways, it makes my work stronger because I built in this time to revise. Okay, so I encourage you now, right, to brainstorm how can you present your weakness with a twist? So how could you say, well, I struggle with X, but, and then share potentially a way that you manage it or are actively overcoming that weakness. Okay, so I'm going to give you another minute to think about this. Sometimes this is a little mind bendy, all right? So take your time thinking, how could I present the weakness, but then how could I also twist it, okay? And if it's something that you've trouble twisting, feel free to type it in the chat box. Maybe we can all brainstorm together. You're welcome to type your weakness and your twist into the chat if you'd like, or you can just do this on your own. Great, these are excellent. So we have quite a few examples. Multiple people talked about public speaking, fear of public speaking as being a weakness, and how they're overcoming that is to purposely force themselves into situations where they have to do it so that they will improve, so that they will overcome the fear, and so they will become more comfortable doing it in the future. That's great, right? And you can layer that into your anecdotes. You can also talk about that explicitly. Here's what I'm doing to overcome it. And then you can also share stories about those public speaking experiences that went well, right? So that's excellent. There was one earlier, I want things on time, but I'm working on being flexible with deadlines and being aware there can be setbacks. Yeah, I think this is great. I would just challenge you to think about how more specifically you can talk about overcoming that. So working on is pretty general, right? So I want things on time, but I've talked about this with my coworkers, and we've decided that within 24 hours I can deal with that, or I'm loosening my deadlines with my teammates, something like that. So think about how you can be specific as well, right? Yeah, a couple of people have challenges or weaknesses that we haven't twisted. So too strong of an attention to detail. Yeah, this is a pretty good one, I think, because attention to detail is largely a strength, right? So if you present a weakness, I'm very detail oriented, sometimes so much that I can't see the big picture. Sometimes you can present that as, so I found that I work really well in teams with people who are more big picture people, right? I'm a good teammate with someone who has a wider lens, because we work really well together. So sometimes you can use other people, right? Other people in your experience or potential future experience that would help to solve your weakness by seeing it as a strength. Yeah, these are really good. Okay, taught myself emotional intelligence, great. So you're proactive, you're learning skills on your own. Crossing things off your to-do list when you're not good at prioritizing, that's a really concrete way of explaining that you're dealing with a weakness. That's great. More public speaking. Yeah, great. Indecisive, can't discard ideas and take too long sometimes. Yeah, this is one I actually hear pretty frequently. So, you know, start coming up with a strategy, try something now and see if it works. So like I make pro-cons lists, pros and cons lists. I talk about it with, you know, my roommate, my friend, my mom. You know, I flip a coin, probably not the best strategy, but coming up with strategies that you can try and see if they work for you. So then you can report that you've tried them and that either, you know, they're working or you're still seeking a solution. I don't think public speaking is considered a cliche weakness. I think it's the #2 fear when polled, at least in the US, after heights. So I think people see it and recognize it as something that a lot of people struggle with. And therefore, I don't think it's cliche. I think the cliche weaknesses are, I'm a perfectionist. This is a really like cheat answer, because if you're a perfectionist, your employer is not going to find that to be a weakness. And also, I'm a workaholic. I just work too much. No employer is going to be like, oh no, save me from this horrible weakness, right? They're going to see that as a strength. So those are two cliche weaknesses that aren't really sharing anything about yourself other than you can be creative to get out of the question, I think, and not really that creative because they're cliche. Yeah, time management, I think that's a lot like the procrastination example I gave. So what strategies can you use? Can you, use a to-do list? Can you keep a calendar with alarms? Can you set artificial deadlines? Do you have an accountability buddy, like a coworker or a teammate who you send each other your work before the deadline so that you make sure you get things in on time? Come up with some of these strategies, try them, and then be able to share what has worked for you to overcome that challenge. Great. If anybody, I won't take any more of our time by talking about specific weaknesses, but if anybody moving forward found this to be a useful activity to think through, you're welcome to email me and we can talk through things on your own time. But I do really recommend you take the time to think about it, because one of the worst things that can happen is you're asked the question by a potential employer and you're not sure what to say. That can be really stressful, right? So give yourself the time to think through it ahead of time. Do you have strategies to find our strengths? I'm not sure where to start when I'm asked that question. This is challenging, right? Absolutely. I would start with close friends and ask them. Sometimes you'll be really surprised at the answers. I know that that's not necessarily in a work environment, but a lot of times what we're good at in our relationships is the same thing we're good at when we're in a team. So I would ask, family members, I would ask friends, if you work with people on class projects, I would just say, hey, I'm getting ready for the job market and I really hate that strengths and weakness questions. What are your strengths? And do you have any idea what I could use as mine, right? I think people are usually pretty observant and could give you at least some places to start. Another thing is just Google strengths and weaknesses job interview and see what comes up and read through the list, and maybe one of them will hit you and be like, oh yeah, I do really like to ask questions. I am really good at being critical to make sure that we find the flaws in a plan before we move forward. So those are two options that you might want to consider. Yeah, thanks for asking. Great. And then, yeah, Strength Finder assessment. Sure, those types of things could help you. Strength Finder, I think you can get as a book, or I don't know if they have an online version. Maybe Ritika could give some, could give a source. But yeah, Strengths Finder is a resource that you could potentially take. Kind of walks you through like a bunch of questions, like a survey. Yeah, the book comes with an online code. Absolutely. Yeah, thank you. That's a great suggestion. Okay, so that was our how, right? That we really wrapped up the idea of those anecdotes, sharing those anecdotes, not only to answer the question, but to share our personal strengths. And I just remember always that you're trying to present yourself as this three-dimensional person who has strengths, who has weaknesses, who has interests, right? Who has a life. Yes, the employer wants you to work, but they don't want you just to be a laundry list of past experiences, right? They're not going to remember somebody who leaves the room and just recited their CV, recited their resume. They're going to remember who you were in the room, right? Yeah, this isn't just for job interviews, also informational interviews where you're meeting new people who are in positions you're potentially interested in, at career fairs, or those dreaded social events, you know, where you're visiting an employer and they take you to a basketball game. You still want to be able to be social and share stories, right, that share a little bit of information about yourself, and still make yourself, you know, sound like the good candidate that you are. So I got a question, would these weaknesses be okay for medical school interviews? I don't have any insider knowledge on medical school interviews. My understanding of the strength and weakness question is it's largely applicable to all fields, but that might be a better question for maybe your career counselor or your academic advisor who may have more information specifically about medical school interviews. I'm sorry that I'm just not an expert in that field at all. So yeah, just to sum up, some next steps that we recommend are, like I said, start collecting anecdotes early. It's a lot easier if you have some ideas, some notes when you're getting ready for the job interview process or going to a career fair. Be creative in flipping those weaknesses so that you can share the weakness, but also share that maybe it's made you better at something, right? Now I do it this way and I found that my work has really benefited. A lot of times when we find things that are challenging, we create ways to get better at them, right? So that's something that really shows, one, you know yourself, and two, you put in the time and effort to improve yourself. Those are really good things for an employer to know. Lastly, of course, Penn State Career Services and SMIL Career Services, of course, has tons of resources that you can use, but we do exist as well. Like one more time, we are EPPIC. So I absolutely welcome you to join us. We have workshops that you can register for on our website, but also we have those one-on-one meetings that I mentioned, and anything that you're working on, whether it is your resume, your cover letter, preparing for a job interview, you know, materials for application materials for grad school, anything like that, we're happy to look at from a language and cultural point of view. So of course you have career services as your career experts, but we can look at things from kind of that English for professional purposes lens that we put on everything. So if that's something that you're interested in, feel free to visit our website and check out our services, and you can register for everything online. And if you have any general questions or comments that you'd like answered, you're welcome to email us at epic@psu.edu, or you're welcome to just email me. I'm beck@psu.edu. So with that, I think maybe my motor mouth ended a little early, Jana, but if anyone has any questions for me, I'm happy to take them. But otherwise, I can turn things back over to the hosts.
Great. Thank you so much to both Dr. Graham and Rebecca for their presentations. Very insightful information as you're preparing for your next step in your career journey. So maybe a question for both of you. You know, as a career coach, when we meet with students, we're encouraging students when they attend recruiting events or engaging with recruiters to dig a little bit deeper to identify perhaps an employer that is the best cultural fit. So you both had talked about skill sets that the individual could take to make them more employable, but how does the student figure out from the employer or the company side how their values and strengths really fit into that company culture? And to extend that question a little bit, you know, if someone is applying to a society that's different from their background, so thinking about high-low context cultures or individualistic versus collectivist societies, there's different values and different skill sets to take into consideration when you're developing your cover letter and your resume and some of the skills that you're promoting. So how does someone gain insight into some of these global career competencies? I was wondering if either of you, and it looks like Dr. Graham has his hand raised, so I'll let you go first.
Thank you very much, Jenna. I'd like to start with this observation for everyone on the call. I met Rebecca through today's call. No, I've never worked with her before. I found that she went through such good material that I'd like to suggest that everyone on this call do something. This call's being recorded. I would suggest you get the link to access the recording and go to Rebecca's section and watch it or listen to it with a friend who isn't on today's call and discuss it with them. I'm going to give you some really fast examples. Rebecca talked about interviewing for information, which is different from interviewing for a job. Rebecca uses the STAR model. I use it in my consulting. I have a slight different, one very small difference in the language. I find that those who do reflections themselves, who journal, etc., are very happy to hear the word reflection at the end. Those who think they're hard-boiled, two-fisted leaders, I use the word lesson and I add the word extracted. You understand a culture by talking to those who work within it. So specific to this question, I would interview for information with those who work there and those who have worked there. And the questions you want to ask are as much about work life and culture and decision-making and degree of control and length of work day, length of work week, as they are about specific tasks, who's your boss, what has been your latest promotion. Rebecca, what are your thoughts?
I thank you for those nice words, and absolutely I agree. I think talk with as many people as you can, and don't be afraid to ask questions about things like company culture or cultural in general. I find generally people really like answering questions like that. They don't know what you don't know, right? So it is completely transparent for them, and they have no idea that this could be foreign to anyone else. So they won't know that it's unusual, and they won't know what you might have questions about. You really have to be kind of the instigator there and ask those questions. I'd also recommend, depending on your level, the Penn State Career Services, I think, has a service called Candid Careers, which is just a series of videos where people talk about their job and how their education pathway led them there. And that can be really, I think, informative for things like this of seeing how people kind of developed themselves into their careers can be really eye-opening. Because I think Ken mentioned something earlier, we always have maybe a shape, an idea of where we're going to end up, but those pathways can be very, very varied, right? And it's interesting to hear other people explain those. It shows a little bit of insight into the corporate culture and also the culture at large.
Great, thank you. Any last questions for our panelists? Okay, so we have a question: how to find jobs that accept international students easily rather than asking the organization?
I personally would do it through networking again. If anyone on this call has ever played pool, even once, the direct shot is cue ball to numbered ball into a pocket. There's also something called a bank shot. The cue ball goes off the rail. Most of our career conversations are better explored, I think, with a bank shot. That is, with an indirect approach. Quick example, I was asked to do an assignment for a privately owned oil company in Russia, and I was there as a consultant. I wanted to know what the issue was that no one would talk about. I could sense there was one, didn't know how to do it. I called a friend of mine who'd started his own company in London. He's the CEO of this company he started. And I said, do you know anyone who works in this organization? He said, yes, but the person I know works for this organization in the Middle East. I contacted the person in the Middle East, and he said, I'll swear you to secrecy. Don't tell anyone in the organization at headquarters that you talked with me. And here's the background. That's a bank shot where you go to someone else who can give you the information or can give you some information about what it's like inside the organization. There's a lot about careers that is unspoken because people are familiar with them when they work there. When they don't work there, Answers to specific questions like, do they have a rotation program? Will they move you from country to country? Will you get broad experience? Do they select people for both capability and their ability today to do task work? You can ask employees, you can ask former employees, and sometimes ask employees, if you can talk with one, who is a former employee I might talk with? Go through the chain of relationships to ask the questions that will give you candid answers to what's there. I'll bet Rebecca has a thought here too. I saw her shaking her head.
I was just going to say more Penn State resources. Lion Link, look for, follow your friends who are international students, where they're linked, where their friends are linked, right? I mean, we have these digital resources so you can follow that map and use Penn State institutional knowledge. So you might know one person who has found a job, they might know someone, right? Career services, career services at large. Penn Staters are employed all over the world. So use that, don't be afraid to ask those questions where those people have gotten those jobs. Penn State is an enormous web of people that you can tap into. So don't be afraid to.
2 thumbs up, Rebecca. Thank you.
Well, let's thank our presenters so much for being here.